Good morning, everyone. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I currently run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Welcome today to today's panel discussion, Women in Work, the Impact of Gender-Based Violence, which is organized by the Latin America program in collaboration with the Middle East program, the Mexico Institute, and the Asia program. November 25th, 2020 marked the beginning of the United Nations 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence, which is an annual international campaign that kicks off on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and runs until December 10th, which marks Human Rights Day. And in recognition of those 16 days of activism, and in parallel with the UN campaign worldwide, the Wilson Center is hosting a series of events, publications, podcasts, in order to facilitate dialogue and understanding, not only of this ongoing crisis that we see worldwide, gender-based violence, unfortunately made worse by this pandemic, but also of the programs and policies that are beginning to make a little bit of difference. As UN Women noted recently with its most recent figures, this year has seen a pandemic of violence, with gender-based violence reaching alarming proportions. Globally, 243 million women and girls were abused by an intimate partner in the past year, and less than 40% of women who experience violence report it or seek help. With strict lockdowns in place to spread the COVID-19 virus, the violence against women, especially domestic violence, intensified, where in some parts of the world, calls to hotline increased fivefold. So this is a very timely discussion. We are delighted today to zoom in into the world of women in work and better understand how gender-based violence affects this dynamic of women in the labor market. How basically unequal status due to legislative or sociocultural barriers or power dynamics in the labor markets affect women's access to economic opportunities, and how they leave women more vulnerable to harassment and violence. I am really delighted to be introducing our esteemed panelists for today's discussion to focus on various regions of the world. So we will start with Laura Mcdonald, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. She's published numerous articles in journals and edited collections on issues such as the role of non-governmental organizations in development, civil society, citizen struggles in Latin America, with a focus on also Canadian development assistance and the political impact of NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. Monica Salazar, who holds a JD from the Monterey Institute of Technology and Higher Education and has an LLM in Human Rights. She's the co-founder of the Institute for Women in Migration and has worked with several organizations focused on human trafficking and human rights. Rana Hosseini, a Jordanian woman who is the author of the book Murder in the Name of Honor, a well-known human rights activist in the Middle East region, a senior journalist with the Jordan Times. Hosseini focused on the issue of the so-called honor crimes for over 25 years of her reporting. And Ritu Diwan, who is vice president of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, professor and director at the Department of Economics at the University of Mumbai, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, and president of the Indian Association for Women's Studies. So welcome to all of you. We're delighted that you'll be joining this panel this morning. I'm going to ask a kickoff question, and we're going to start with you, Laura. And then, so we'll have you answer in 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will hopefully have a discussion with the audience's questions coming in order to broaden this discussion as much as possible. So how does gender-based violence affect women in the workforce, in the region that you're focused on in Latin America? What are the main legal, sociocultural, or other barriers that allow this problem to persist? Laura.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Is it okay if I share my screen? I can do that, right? So thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this really important event. It's amazing to be able to share these ideas with people, women from around the world, only women in this particular occasion. And I'm going to try to be brief and not overlap too much with my fellow panelist, Monica, also speaking about Latin America. So it's important to recognize that violence against women in Latin America, which has been the subject of enormous attention in the last few years, is not confined to the domestic realm, but permeates every aspect of women's lives. So I wanted to make the point that we often talk about the private and the public sphere, and efforts to address violence against women often focus on the so-called private sphere of the household, and ignore the role that employers or fellow workers might play in perpetrating violence against women. According to national surveys by the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean from 6 countries in the region, between 60 and 76% of women, around 2 out of every 3, have been the victim of gender-based violence in distinct areas of their lives. In addition, on average, 1 out of every 3 women has been the victim of or is now suffering psychological, physical, and/or sexual violence at the hands of a perpetrator. And this sometimes escalates into the most serious form of violence, which is the phenomenon of feminicide. And as Marissa mentioned, this situation has only intensified in the context of the coronavirus. Currently in Latin America and the Caribbean, more than 100 million women, some 50% of the working age population, are part of the labor force. So that's a huge increase in recent years. And the most recurrent forms of violence and harassment in the workplace in the Americas are dismissal and harassment for organizing, preventing someone from going to the doctor, or caring for a family member, or creating difficulty for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. There are wage gaps, as well as physical aggressions such as confinement, unwanted advances, intimidation, and sexual abuse, sometimes resulting in unwanted pregnancies. In addition, workers are sometimes subject to bullying for various reasons, including on grounds of their sexual orientation, race, or even age. So the globalization and neoliberal reforms have intensified the employment of women, which is often taken for granted as something that will contribute to women's empowerment. But the conditions under which women are entering the workforce in the context of neoliberalism mean that they are often subject to new forms of abuses once they enter the workforce. So I mostly work on Mexico, so some of my references are going to be to Mexico, but many of them apply to other countries of the region. So one iconic story or prominent story was that of the murders of women, some 400 women who were murdered in Ciudad Juarez in the 1990s. And many of these women were working in the maquiladoras, which are labor-intensive factories, mostly on the US-Mexico border, that tend to employ high numbers of women. So when Mexican women entered the workforce, they tended to go into the maquilas, where they were often subject to abuses in the workplace, but also traveling to and from their workplace. So many of those women who were killed were maquila workers who were seen as somehow stepping out of their appropriate domain by men who may have lost their own jobs as a result of globalization and this intensified machismo and jealousy against women. So in the maquilas, women are frequently subject to sexual harassment by supervisors and other management, as well as security guards. Both female and male workers may experience violence in the workplace, including verbal and physical abuse by supervisors to coerce workers to meet high production quotas. Workers who try to form unions often also face violence and threats of violence. Lack of adequate transportation and or lighting and other security measures outside the workplace expose women to possible violence. In the workplace, the rejection of or submission to sexual harassment is often explicitly or implicitly used as the basis for a decision that affects the victim's access to professional training, a job, a promotion, or a salary level. According to data from Mexican labor authorities, 3 out of every 4 women are harassed. One of those victims is fired, and 4 out of 10 victims quit. That should say quit. As we know, there are also severe problems with trying to unionize in the maquilas, something the NAFTA labor accord, or especially the new USMCA, tries to address, but the unions themselves are often rife with sexism and are not often led by men and aren't sensitive to the specific problems faced by women workers. Although the Mexican Constitution establishes the equality of men and women before the law, sexual harassment is often an unacknowledged form of conduct that in practice nullifies that constitutional protection. Another sphere that women have entered the workforce into is the area of domestic work and the informal sector in general. 1 of every 4 women in the region earning a wage, nearly 20 million women, works in someone else's home. An ILO study found that 8 out of 10 domestic workers report to have survived physical or sexual abuse in the workplace. These kinds of violence could be labor exploitation, sexual harassment, etc. Sorry, I keep jumping forward. And there have been organizers amongst domestic workers and informal sector workers to demand decent work, as these women from Bolivia are protesting here in support of Convention 189 of the ILO that respects the rights of domestic workers. But that's a long struggle. Violence in the informal sector can come from a number of sources, including the state itself. Women who are working as vendors in the street, for example, are often targeted for harassment and abuse by municipal police, traffic officials, border officials, but they can also be targeted by fellow workers, household members, etc. Okay, no, it's not working. Okay, another issue I wanted to mention quickly is an issue I've been studying with a team of fellow researchers looking at issues related to violence against women or violence women experience going to and from work. So in Mexico City, we've been studying this situation. And of course, women have to get to work. They're not just in the workforce, but they have to get back and forth. And the conditions under which they travel are often subject them to new forms of abuses. Crowded buses and subway trains are rife with forms of sexual abuse. And Mexico City was shown to be the most dangerous transport system for women out of 5 of the world's biggest commuter cities in a 2018 Thomson Reuters Foundation poll. And women said that other passengers often turned a blind eye to abuse. About 3 out of every 4 women in Mexico City who were polled said they were afraid of using the transportation system because of the risk of harassment and abuse that they would confront there, as well as the paths leading to and from the subway or the areas that connect the buses that are coming in from the outside of the city into the Mexico City itself are also extremely unsafe. So there's been ways that this has been addressed. I showed this example here in Mexico City has been attempting to address issues related to to violence in the transportation system and in the pathways leading to and from transportation, with the use of more cameras, more police, help booths, and famously women-owned buses or women-owned cars on the subway, which is a common measure actually around the world. Other measures include public campaigns to raise awareness, highlighting women's rights to travel in safety. This program is called Viajemos Seguras. And there's a pink bus there that's an example of a Metrobus in Mexico City that's been created, hopefully, to reduce this problem. So I'm just going to conclude by mentioning one more thing that maybe other people will be talking about, but this is the ILO Convention 190 on ending violence and harassment in the world of work. And this was a convention that was supported in the International Labor Conference in 2019. So it was voted to adopt this convention at that conference, which represented a significant victory for informal workers, especially women, whose organizations had worked tirelessly for years to address, to get the ILO to address the realities of the world's most vulnerable workers, including women. And so that convention includes a broad definition of the world at work that includes workers working without formal contracts, and also defines the workplace broadly, mentioning both public and private spaces, because of course domestic workers are entering into the so-called private sphere when they're working in people's households, which subjects them to even higher levels of abuse. So I have some other ideas about what can be done to address this situation, but I'll stop there and come back to that later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this sobering presentation. We'll turn to you, Monica, and I know that your focus has been on human trafficking. So perhaps you can zoom in there to sort of give us a better idea as to how in the world of women and work, how a lot of the abuses are also connected to the very serious problem of human trafficking that we see globally.
Thank you, Marisa. Yes, that's a huge issue, and I would like to address my presentation from that perspective. And I would also like to thank Laura because she contacted me, and we would like to share different information instead of just mixing the whole thing. Yes, my background has been working with migrants and human trafficking victims. And from our perspective in the region, we have been facing a lot of different situations. And I prepared not a presentation, but a certain topics that I would like to cover. So I will start by saying that most of the actions have been focusing against or to eradicate gender-based violence in Latin America, had been addressed to work not from a workplace perspective, because most of the eradication things that have been passing in the region address different kind of violence, and somehow we haven't been able to take that in consideration. However, when we talk about violence in our workplaces, many things is still a priority and a challenge in the region. Why? Because as Laura mentioned, we have been facing a lot of different violence. So somehow talking about violence in a work environment has been something that we haven't been able to address properly until today. In the region, there are two big human rights conventions where most of the focus starts against to eradicate violence. From the convention, Belém do Pará, which is a very regional document, but also from CEDAW, which is this international document who mainly address different kind of violence. And somehow the policies and also the law reforms had been towards to eradicate the violence stated in those documents. But somehow the documents regarding work and also other human rights like the ILO conventions that Laura mentioned have been very, very difficult to approach in our backgrounds. The adoption of international human rights instruments has protected human rights from reflex and consensus in the region when we talk about harassment, but also sexual violence. But when we talk about labor rights, that's a very different perspective and also a very different approach. Somehow we haven't been able to address properly both things. Somehow when people talk about violence against women, they kind of split the situation in these two kind of broad scenarios, the labor one, but also the other different violence we suffer in the region. In order to do that, for the past 3 decades, has been considerable the number of countries in the region that have taken measures to pass law and reform legal procedures to convert criminal justice systems from inquisitorial to oral arguments, accusatorials, in order to provide the freedom and also the right to present the victims' opinions and hearings in the systems. But the discriminatory social cultural patterns and behavior still persist in detrimental to prevent and obstruct the enforcement of existing laws and effective punishment of those acts of violence. The way in which officials in the administration of justice systems react to cases involving violence against women reflects the fact that these discriminatory social cultural partners are still very much intact, establishing that violence affects women in a variety of ways and obstructs their exercise of their basic civil, political, economical, social, and cultural rights. Regarding the relationship between gender-based violence and discrimination in workplaces, indicates that violence of this kind is a reflection of historical unequal power relationship between women and men, which is still a huge problem in the region, that occurs in public and private, within home or community, whether perpetrated by individuals or agents of the state. This situation shall take special account of the vulnerability of women to violence by reasons of, among other factors, race, ethnic background, their migrant status, refugees, displaced persons, and similar consideration is to be given to women subject to violence who are pregnant or disabled, or minor age, elderly, socio-economical disadvantage, affected by armed conflicts or deprived of their freedom, such as human trafficking victims. Most of the efforts in the region have been based to eradicate sex trafficking. However, forced labor and labor trafficking remain unidentified, either in formal or informal sectors. The ILO conventions, such as the 180 convention that Laura mentioned, has been only ratified by Uruguay in the region, which is a clear example of the gap that we are facing right now. As a conclusion, I will say that accountability of gender equality achievements is still deficient, insufficient, but also we are facing a huge problem of funding persisting on gender equality agenda in the region. Domestic resources as well as international have been gradually reduced. Considerable public spending reduction has been taking place, affecting negatively government resources mobilization to achieve gender equality. We are still having a lot of work to do in the region, and we also are still having to or be concerned of the escalation of gender violence in the several target areas, showing partners of human rights violations and impunity at all levels, in particular enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, among others. Nevertheless, the COVID-19 pandemic place a huge stress on labor rights worldwide, from which women will be one of the most affected social groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. You raise many points that I had in mind for questions, particularly on some of these international conventions, as Laura mentioned, the ILO convention, and how these are actually enacted locally, right? Or in each region, because it's great to have these conventions, but then there's the additional challenge of basically implementing these legal reforms within these countries. So we're gonna turn now to Rana Hosseini to give us the view from the Middle East. I'm pretty sure that there are many common threads, unfortunately, that have already been mentioned. Rana, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this invitation and this important opportunity to talk about something really that is of great interest and importance for women in our region. I want to talk about Jordan, and I think this applies to the majority of the region. In Jordan, the percentage of women in the labor market is around 14%. It's a very low percentage, and this is something that we've been trying to increase for the longest time. Talking about violence, I saw that you tackled a lot of things that I won't repeat, but I want to highlight certain topics that the women's movement or certain women NGOs that tackled that I thought was very interesting, because I usually cover other things, but I got involved in this as well. Basically, there was a group of young women, young mothers, who established an organization called Sadaqa, and basically they were trying to change the laws to ensure that there are more nurseries at working places, because one of the main reasons for women to leave is once she delivers, most employers will either not have her back, or to start with, they will not hire women who are married early, or ones who just got married. And this is a form of violence for me. It's violence before even the woman starts, to try to know if she's going to get pregnant or if she becomes married. They don't want, there is all kinds of stories that we hear about that. So this group of women, they were basically fighting for changing the laws to include nurseries at workplace, and they did succeed to have nurseries, and this took them almost 10 years to work on something like this. This way, women will not have to leave the job early. They can advance at work, because this is another form of violence. Women have to leave, and then they cannot advance, even if they return. So I think this is a very important experience here in Jordan. I don't know how many countries went through such an experience. There is also another issue that this group worked on, and other groups, which I also thought it was interesting. Mrs. Laura, you talked about Mexico and the transportation system. They have a good transportation system. In Jordan, we don't have a good transportation system for women to go safely and easily to their jobs. So our problem even starts before the woman goes to the bus. And of course, the transportation we have women who are subjected to forms of violence and sexual harassment, but I don't think it's the extent that is taking place in Mexico. I know there is a lot of problems, especially the killing of women in the 90s, as you mentioned in your presentation. So this is something also that the women's groups here are trying to work on, is securing a safe and reliable transportation system. Because, for example, owning a car, it's a bit expensive. We have taxes, we have a lot of the insurance is high. Not all women can afford to buy a car, especially like if ones with a low income. So they depend on the transportation system naturally. So sometimes they have to take more than one transportation system, for example, to reach their work, which means that almost more than half of the salary is gone on transportation, and most of the time it's not reliable. it doesn't come on time. Sometimes, you know, it might take hours, so they miss their jobs. Or so this is something also that the women's movement has been working on for a long time. Of course, another problem and another form of violence that was practiced against women, again, is sexual harassment at work. And of course, you all know, you're all experts, you know that many women, let's say in our part of the world, instead of going through the sexual harassment and being exposed, or her family or someone will know that she was subjected to sexual harassment, she prefers just to walk away and leave the job rather than stay and, you know, receive this unfair treatment. So the women's movement also tried very hard to incriminate sexual harassment at work. Unfortunately, this move was met with resistance from conservative and Islamist deputies when the law was discussed in the parliament. And, you know, their concern was they don't want the term sexual harassment, you know, as if they don't want to, this doesn't exist, or they don't want to have it in the legal textbooks. So, but the good thing is that this issue was up in the air. It was spoken about. So sexual harassment became something known, even if they don't want to include it or they don't want to incriminate it. At least this term now is more known. More women know that there is you know, they could be subjected to sexual harassment, and there are women organizations and NGOs that has hotlines that they can help these women. So this is something I think it's important. Their argument is that there are other legal articles in the you know, textbooks that incriminates, let's say, indecent behaviors and so forth. So basically, the good thing is that there's been a lot of work in Jordan for the past 10 years about this issue. This opened the door for other countries in the region also to talk about this topic. These topics in the past were not publicly debated. They were not up in the air. Nobody was really talking about them. So for the past 10 years or so, in our part of the world, I feel that there is more focus on women's empowerment in the workforce. And the good thing is that there are realizations and acknowledgement by the government and by the society and by the women themselves that they might be subject to some form of violence. The government took action by changing laws. The civil society got involved, and the women got more acknowledged and aware about this topic. So basically, this is from my experience, let's say, in Jordan in terms of violence in the labor. Of course, the last thing, which I think is everywhere in the world, is pay equity. The women, of course, get paid less than men. This is all known. And there are also women's groups who are working on that to try to secure equal pay, you know, for both men and women. And I will stop here, and maybe later we can, you know, if you have any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Rana. And the challenges that you mentioned with regards to transportation, I know that research we've done last year, for example, in Tunisia and Egypt, there was major concern about women's safety, particularly in rural areas where there are accidents that happen where there, you know, if the victims were women, and those are women being transported from their homes to some of the local farms, for example, if the victims were women, they would just not report them, and there are hundreds that go unreported that way, and that's also another form of that. So it is definitely a challenge across the region. Yeah.
I just want to say one more thing. I just remembered now when you talked about Egypt. Actually, around 10 or 12 years ago, Egypt, and I'm sure, Marissa, you know, I think they've done a movie. I think it was called 789 or 678. It was a number of a bus. And it was it talked about a woman who used transportation every day to go to work, and how she was harassed every day. And through her, they also talked about other women being subjected to sexual harassment. But the symbolic part about it is the bus, that she's always had to ride the bus, and she was always harassed. And this was an important movie because it really opened more eyes on sexual harassment that is being subjected against women in Egypt, because over there the transportation, their buses, if it fits 20 people, 60 people end up going in the bus, and they're all like together like this, like sardines, and women get to get harassed. So that by the way, that film was really important, and thank you for bringing this up. You reminded me of this film. I was in Egypt by coincidence, and it was in the cinema, and I went and watched it, and I thought that was really important.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing it up. We'll talk a little bit later about the awareness campaigns and the role of the media and film, for example. So thanks for reminding us of that. Before we turn to Asia, and particularly the presentation from Ritu, I'd like to remind the audience that they can submit questions to brazil@wilsoncenter.org, or just tweet using the hashtag gender@Wilson. Ritu, give us the view from South Asia, but particularly from India. I know you've done a lot of work on both the workforce, the labor market, but also women's issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marisa, and I'm so glad to be on this panel, because I've been hearing the other three speakers, and I mean, the extent of commonality is amazing. So the bases, the varieties, the formations, and the source of it, I think that is something which really I would like to talk on. You see, one is South Asia and locating India within South Asia. And I would like to say, actually, not even South Asia, probably in the entire world, that India has one of the lowest work participation rates of women at men, and it's something which is steadily being declining. In fact, it's only one of the 3 countries in the world where the workforce participation of women has been declining. And it's, the latest figures were out just about 2 weeks ago, and it's only 14% of urban women who work, which is a recorded thing. So what do the others do, So that's another area. If they're studying or doing other things, one can understand, or they have enough income, so they don't need to be a second earner in the classical sense of the term. The problem, what we are facing in India right now, one is, of course, the pandemic. I mean, that affects every country. But for our country, very strangely, and very, I think one has to put it in that context, but I'm talking in the context of women and work, that when the pandemic came, we were already in a state of collapse, economically, in terms of employment, in terms of poverty. For the first time, we had an actual percentage of population below a very, very low poverty line of $1 a day, actually increasing in 42 years. Also declining growth rates, etc. Very much, and again the data came out just, I think, 2 days ago, is the gender gap, what we call the wage gap in the urban areas and in the rural areas. So if a woman was getting, say, 2/3 of what a man earned, now it's less than half in many areas of what a man earns. Now this is pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, I won't even say it's the pandemic which has impacted so much. It's the policy response to the pandemic, which has really made matters much, much worse. And a whole lot of, covert measures. I really want to say that covert measures, there's no other word to use it, which are going on under the cover of, or the camouflage of COVID. So while everyone's busy with, coping with their lives and labor and livelihoods, in just barely surviving, because there's no state support which is being given to any family at all, is a whole lot of laws which are being passed, which go against work, which go against women, and which impact very significantly the issue of violence and work. And this is something which is not only for women, but very, very much so for men. In fact, in that context, I just want to say that I wish our panel also had a man, Somehow we marginalize ourselves when it's gender-based violence, and only women are talking about gender-based violence. It's a human rights issue. It's a national issue. It's an issue, international issue. It's an issue of equality. So it's like when I talk about gender issues and I teach, the first thing I ask is what's the opposite of patriarchy? And a whole lot of students reply matriarchy. And I say, no, the opposite is equality. And that's really what we have to really talk about. So now for us, the situation, and I don't want to romanticize the past, but and certainly I think what is happening in the present is something which is what I call a process of de-equalization of gender. Whatever few rights one had achieved in terms of employment, in terms of facilities at work, in terms of safety at work, all those are now legally taken away. Whether it's in terms of nutrition or education, but I'm talking particularly of work. Of course, the incidence of violence is huge, and gender violence is one major aspect, which I will come to maybe later in discussion. But there are many studies which are there where India is concerned, and this happens much more in India than it does in Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nepal, and that is the violence at work against women. And many studies which we have done that, I'd say, amongst garment workers, which is an industry which is common to 5 or 6 or 7 of our neighboring countries, including Sri Lanka, is that a minimum of 1 in 7 garment workers has been raped by the employer. Okay, the harassment at workplace takes it's not only harassment by co-workers. That is, I think, a relatively lesser issue. I'm not saying it's not bad, but the violence by the employer, by the contractor, because you have a huge amount of home-based work. In fact, 95%, 94% of India's women work outside the formal economy. All right, so either they're making cigarettes in their homes, or embroidery, or own accounts, or what we call self-help groups, agriculture, horticulture, livestock, the typical context of what is underdeveloped countries, vendors, hawkers, many of these categories. Also, what we found that, of course, there is a reporting of cases of violence against women at work, but 70% goes unreported. That is what our studies have shown. And even those that are reported, there are no police cases which are filed. Often it takes about 6 months or 1 year to get a police case filed. And by that time, all the medical evidence, of course, has just gone. Now, I just want to talk about these codes. We have a huge number of laws which we have struggled for since independence in 1947. And we got the Equal Remuneration Act, and we got, Minimum Wages Act, and any kind of an act. Implementation may be a different issue, but at least you had legal recourse you could go to court and you could say that, yes, this is your right. Now, in the last, and what has happened is, without any parliamentary debate, we're supposed to be a parliamentary democracy, these laws have just come in by ordinance, okay, by an executive order, without any discussion, without any debate. And in fact, right now in India, we have a huge demonstration of farmers, of women farmers, and of men farmers, to the extent of 10 million farmers who are camping in the capital, near the capital, and asking for the repeal of a whole lot of laws which go against the issue of labor rights. Now, I'm not going to in detail, there's a lot, maybe we can have a separate session, but there are different codes which have been passed, and all the labor laws are now repealed. All of them have been replaced, whatever we've achieved from 1947, and they've been replaced by 4 laws, okay, 4 codes. And the preamble itself is so clear. It says these labor codes, just see the contradiction. These labor codes are for the ease of doing business. Okay, so you're very clearly labor to give up its rights for the right of capital and for the right of profit. So I think that whole context of neoliberal paradigm, etc., is something which really has to be taken into account. Now, what these codes do is they redefine worker. So anybody who is outside a public employer-employee relationship, that is working outside the household, is now not defined as a worker. They have no rights to any kind of whatever minimal labor laws, including sexual harassment, which is there. So your domestic workers are out of the definition of worker, they're out of the definition of work, they're out of the definition of workplace. Okay, all three components. Your own account workers, those who are employed by contractors, those who are apprentice, all of them are out now of any kind of labor legislation. Also the way, and you know, these all act as barriers. There are also, of course, calculation of minimum wages, which has been changed totally. So a man is one full unit and a woman is 80% of a male unit. You know, presuming that she works less and she consumes less and she needs to be given less. There is also now creches have been removed as part of the conditions of work. Toilets have been removed as a part of the condition of work. Okay, and these are very problematic issues where women are concerned. I mean, creches we know is a very, very fundamental issue. Also, what has been removed is the right to know, or the protection from sexual harassment at the workplace. So as a worker, you can no longer complain of sexual harassment by your employer or by your co-worker. This is now by law. So a total separation of the safety of women at workplace and the issue of violence at workplace. There is absolutely no recourse where this is concerned. Also, what has been changed is there is now no women's representation. All that has been withdrawn at the workplace, whether it's in terms of compliance committees, whether it's in terms of inquiries, even if there are any, into any denial of labor rights. And this works as a very, very important constraint to women's participation in the workplace. There is also, and this I really I want to talk about very much so, we have also, Sri Lanka has, and many other places, Bangladesh has many, Pakistan has many, and I'm sure many of the other, I mean, all the countries have what we call export promotion zones, all right, which is where almost 100% or 99.9% women are employed, but they do not have any rights at the workplace, including that of violence. And I really consider this violence. In India, women in the export promotion zones are given 2 coupons a day to go to the toilet. They cannot go take a toilet break for more than twice a day. And if a woman is pregnant, of course, there is absolutely no recourse to whatever she can do. There is also an ILO and many other international organizations, UN, etc., have objected to this. Of course, there are many struggles which we have taken against this. And that is an increase in the workday. I mean, internationally, we are going from an 8-hour workday to a 6-hour workday, even particularly after the pandemic. But now, India, the minimum work hour has been increased from 8 hours to 10 hours. And when there is so-called emergency production as declared by the employer, it can go up to 16 hours a day. I mean, how do you expect any human to give productive capacity to be able to function at such low nutrition levels and work continuously for 16 hours? There is, I mean, there are many other issues which can be taken up. And the ILO 190 was mentioned. I mean, I was part of the drafting of that. And we redefined work, we redefined workplace to include informal workers, and also tried to bring in the context. You know, it's not so much the world of work. I call it the worlds of work, because women are, it's not only work, it's different, it's a work continuum. So you're going from paid work to unpaid work to underpaid work to care work to it. You know, these things are done very simultaneously. There's multitasking, etc., etc. And very sorry to say that India did not accept that covenant. There are many more. I think there are about 8 or 9 countries which didn't do it, but India very much did not do it. And I don't know how much time I have, but transportation is something I've been working on it for 20 years on physical infrastructure. And, you know, roads, how women use roads differently and men use roads differently, etc. And within this, what I found in my field work, which I've been doing in rural areas, in urban areas, that the violence against women in relation to roads and public transport has actually has actually increased in the last 20 years. And that is primarily because of the lack of investment by the state in public transport and the privatization of public transport, which leaves these women at, you have to pay very high rates. And when you can't afford these high rates of travel, and particularly when it is informal private travel, then you are expected to provide sexual favors in return. So violence is structurally inbuilt into the growth paradigm which is being followed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritu, for your presentation. And you mentioned many of the challenges in India and South Asia that are common themes that we've seen in the Middle East as well as Latin America. So all of you panelists either talked about or touched upon women in the informal sector. And I think, we keep referring to the percentage of women in the workforce. In the Middle East, it's one of the lowest worldwide. In India, South Asia is also, I think, second lowest after the Middle East. But we still see women in the informal sector. We've seen how without any, safety measures or protections, they have been most affected by the current pandemic, for example, but they're always at risk for all types of gender-based discrimination as well as violence. So I wanted to go back to you, Laura, to basically ask how do we tackle this aspect particularly? The informal sector and ensure that women, who are in most cases the majority of workers in the informal sector, are given all the protections that they need. Like, what can the state do? What can civil society do? How do we address that?
Thanks a lot. So I think Monica very well identified the problems of moving from international conventions to domestic implementation. And this is certainly a big problem in Latin America, including Mexico. So, it's important to create these international conventions, to create ideas about what rights women have in the informal sector, in the workplace, but it's very difficult to enact them into law. And we know even that laws that exist are national legislation that exists is often ignored and not implemented because of problems of impunity that are widespread throughout Latin America. So I wanted to mention, though, that there are some countries in Latin America that have made progress around these issues, especially around regularization of informal sector workers and domestic workers. So, for example, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil have adopted rules that put domestic workers on a par with other workers in relation to conditions like holidays, working hours, and maternity pay. They established wage bargaining mechanisms and introduced the idea of formal contracts for domestic workers. So there are some countries in the region that have stronger traditions of protecting social rights, and these governments that enacted this legislation were more left-leaning countries at the time. Brazil, of course, several of these countries have slipped back towards the right. So we'll see what happens under the Bolsonaro regime, whether that's going to go forward. And these measures are happening not because governments are nice or care about women necessarily, but because they're being pushed by civil society, by domestic worker NGOs, trade unions, other civil society organizations to move forward on these issues. Mexico actually also has committed to bringing into law Convention 189 on the rights of domestic workers. under the current government of Lopez Obrador, which is also a big move forward, I think. And so it has deposited the instrument of ratification of Convention 189 into the Senate. So that's a big achievement. I wanted to mention the issue of art as well. I think the film Roma that won an Academy Award brought to the country's attention these difficult issues related to relations within the household, the situation of Indigenous women in particular, and Afro-descendant women as well, who overwhelmingly make up the domestic workforce in Mexico and many other Latin American countries. So the deep racial and ethnic divides that exist allow for the perpetuation of unhumane treatment of women workers. The idea that these women don't have the right to have rights, as Arendt put it, is something that has to be struggled against. So movies like Roma, even if it was a bit romanticized about the employee relationship within the household, at least brought these attentions to the fore, and civil society organizations use that as a very powerful tool to push back against these practices. One other thing I just wanted to mention is also the role of trade agreements. This is an unconventional way to go about this, but the USMCA, the revised NAFTA agreement, does include a labor chapter, unlike the NAFTA agreement, which had a labor side accord, which was not enforceable really. So it's now a labor chapter, and it does include rules about sex-based discrimination in the workforce, and protecting workers against employment discrimination on the basis of sex, including with regard to sexual harassment, sexual orientation, pregnancy, sexual gender identity, and caregiving responsibilities. So that's important. And also the labor reform that Mexico has been implementing even prior to the USMCA does include issues related to, for example, democratization of unions and including gender parity in union leadership, which is really important because unions are the most powerful actor that can affect these types of conditions for women's working conditions. So, all that is important, but, just existing in the USMCA does not guarantee that it will be enforced. We need governments and civil society actors to take up these measures that are included in the labor agreement and actually push for them to be enforced. And so that's going to be a long struggle, and also to democratize and introduce gender parity into Mexican unions is going to be a really long struggle. But I think it's a very interesting and important example of how we can use international policy differently. And just to conclude, I think it's also interesting, like there's been a move towards consideration of the care economy in discussions at international levels, especially in response to the pandemic. That was not this idea of the care economy, the role of care and women's labor has increasingly received attention both in North and the global North and the global South as a result of the unequal attention or the unequal impact of the pandemic and the way that women are suffering the most serious effects of that. So I think that's also a positive element that we can push back against conventional economics and push them to integrate concerns related to gender and gender equality in the workforce.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. You've identified all the major actors that are important to make this work. So it's not just, the government doing this by itself. It's not just civil society, because you need access to centers of power to actually make these changes. And then the implementation part, which is huge. Who is going to hold the government and the authorities accountable at the end of the day, even with all of these important global conventions, as well as regional, in the case of NAFTA, trade deals. Monica, I wanted you to comment on this from the perspective of someone who has been working in the civil society space, and basically at the forefront of a lot of these efforts. So what is the view from your perspective, working with all these different stakeholders to actually push for either the legal reforms or the implementation of the already existing laws?
Thank you. Has been a huge struggle for years. Somehow we haven't been able to add the perspective of the private sector. The governments in the region have tried to implement reforms and laws to somehow agree with the international perspective. But from our point of view, now I'm the director of a civil society organization working to dignified work within Mexico. And we are focusing on a lot of trouble because in the region now, there's a huge discussion about labor conditions against exploitation in the labor places, but also human trafficking. And somehow human trafficking has been used to highlight bad labor conditions. And at the end, we are leaving the workers aside. We are considering them as victims. And in the informal sector is very clear because they don't know how to enforce their human rights or labor rights. They haven't been able to achieve huge steps towards the recognitions of their human rights and labor rights. So when we identify them as trafficking victims, we just remove them from one huge gap into another huge problem, I would say. So the informal sector within the region has been facing a lot of troubles from our perspective in three main areas. One, being heard, being also considered in the discussions. Most of the perspectives addressing bad labor conditions has come from another parts of the world with a very different context, but also with different social considerations and political differences. So when we try to implement different policies within the Latin American context, somehow they don't match. So we ended up placing the workers in a different struggle. The second thing is private sector. They have been agreeing on being accountable in a certain measure. They address the reforms, somehow they change some internal policies, but when the workers want to either have different or freedom to become a member of different unions, they haven't been able. Somehow they have been pushed away if they raise their voices. They have been threatened. They have been forced to quit their jobs. So we ended up facing a different harassment. And the third main thing is that the government has been able to pass some specific measures just to be accountable internationally, but not really to address the topic. There's a huge division in Mexico about formal workers and informal workers, but talking from a human rights perspective, but also knowing human trafficking, we are very concerned about both. And not only because of the NAFTA agreement, because there's a huge lack of data regarding human trafficking on the labor side. If you consider agricultural workers, but domestic workers, but also informal workers in different scenarios, people working in the garment industry, people working in the construction, you will see that there's a huge gap, and we have been able only to consider a very small group of this huge population. So by saying that, from civil society organization, my perspective is that we have been lacking of implementing good actions to bring the voices of the workers into the table. Somehow I understand that violence has been a huge issue, but talking about labor violence has been normalized in our context. So it's very difficult to approach the population and saying the things that you consider normal are not and are human rights violation. And starting from that perspective to build up until human trafficking, for example, has been a huge challenge. So in conclusion, civil society organizations, we are trying to reorganize our perspectives, but also to work together and not split apart. We need to be able to talk in a broader perspective about violence in different contexts and different scenarios, instead of just dividing the whole thing, because we are losing perspective, but also we are confusing the people outside our group or our main goal. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. You've touched upon an issue that is very much related to a question that we received from one of our viewers, and I'll get back to that. But it's, I think, essential to, as you say, unify the voices of civil society in order to exert more pressure where needed to reframe these issues in a way that gets more traction. But then I want to turn to you to also home in on this aspect of safety and protection measures. And I mean, you've already mentioned the role of some of the Jordanian organizations that have been working, but you also mentioned that a lot of this work, which is significant, but yet are considered baby steps in the realm of what we need to do, took 10 years. Excuse me. So there's an uphill battle, clearly. So how do you see the debate, particularly on some of these issues, especially in addressing the informal sector?
Well, as I mentioned before, there's been a lot of steps taken by the civil society, and actually the International Labour Organization also took part. But I wanted to touch on something actually that was brought up here, which is the COVID-19. This is something that I did not tackle, and maybe it's related to your question somehow. In Jordan, like many countries in the world, of course, we were locked in our houses maybe for a few months, and we could only walk. And of course, a lot of women got double burden by staying home and having to take care, because unfortunately the perceived role of the woman mostly is that she is in charge of the children, and then you have the man in the house. So this is another form of violence, because sometimes the perpetrator of violence is in the same house against women and children. So you had a double burden for women to work and to take care of their children. And then we had distance or online learning, which I think also most of the countries suffered from that. So you had also the fact that they had to either quit their jobs because they had to stay home to take care of the children. For a change, actually, I had men, like I wrote stories about that, and there were men who were actually calling on the government to please allow the opening of the nurseries, allow opening of the schools. I don't want my wife to lose her job. So basically, this was, I think, another eye opener for women here in this part of the world. I think that such a crisis basically created new challenges and difficulties for women. And this was also something that the women's groups took attention, and they tried to help women who were even subjected to violence, because there were women who were subjected to violence and they couldn't reach them for help. For not only about work, it was also a big problem for the entire conditions for women during that era. So the problem with the COVID-19, it created a challenge for women, triple, and I don't know how many challenges and duties that also they had to suffer from. And this is something also that the women's groups started to touch on, because they want to help as much as possible. They don't want to add more burdens on women. And like there is a lot of WhatsApp groups. I'm part of them because I'm a journalist, and there's one that's calling on the government to open to open the schools, another one the nurseries. So there is constant debate for, especially let's talk about the private sector. It became a big challenge here. And I think this is the challenge that we all have to think of in the future. We have this COVID-19. Hopefully it will end. I don't know when. It's supposed to end soon, but you never know what might come up next. So we have to think of that and have to strategize in the future on how to deal with such problem. Okay, some people were able to do some work from home, but it's not for everyone. And even when you are working from home, you have your children who are studying online. And studying online is not enough. It's not efficient. They can just not attend classes or have their brains somewhere else. About studying, you have to have a direct contact with the teacher. So these are all problems actually that were brought up during this period. I got to learn about it. I don't have children, so I was like reading on Facebook. People used social media, parents. There were campaigns on social media also to address this. So I think, especially, and of course, the most hit was the private sector, Marissa, that you're asking about, because the government sector, they are covered. The government did not stop the salaries. It's the private sector that was hit the most. Either women losing their jobs or having to have the zillions of things on their heads. So basically, it's something that I think we need to address, like with this kind of challenge, how to address it in the future. Especially in our part of the world, our government was not, I don't think it's not that they are not cooperative. I think it's a new experience for everyone, what happened. And we don't have, as Ms. Richu said from India, there is always problems. It's not only India, it's everywhere. The economic problems, they always, there's always problems. And of course, it's women and children who pay the burden of these economic issues.
Thanks, Rana. Ritu, you've already touched upon the challenges with regards to the informal sector in particularly, but also you've outlined a number of laws that are disadvantaging women in the workforce and adding to this problem. Like we know now, we know why, particularly in India, that we're seeing this problem persist. I wanted to turn to basically the role of women in leadership positions in the government. Would it make a difference if there are women at the table when these negotiations are happening around some of these labor laws or in parliament? Beyond just the work of civil society, which we've seen examples from the Middle East and from Latin America, but beyond just the role of women's groups in civil society, does it make a difference to have women in positions of authority to actually ensure that women's voices are heard and are part of any legal reforms moving forward?
Actually, your question is huge because there are 3 or 4 issues within that. One is having women has not really made a difference because it's a kind of thinking the woman brings or the man brings. So that has not, in fact, the number of women in parliament has actually gone down. And so also in our, local, regional, state assemblies, etc., etc. Second, for the last 2 or 3 years, and particularly since COVID, there has been very limited meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly. So even if there were women to talk, there is no space to talk at all. All right. There are a lot of civil society organizations, huge number of unions, of NGOs, etc. But, earlier, at least voices were heard. We got the right to food, we got the right to work, we got guarantee of employment, we got, many of these rights, for right to education. This is all part of the Constitution. But none of these now are being implemented. And this is not only in relation to the pandemic. It is even before that. It's become much worse now. On the broader issue of violence and the role of civil society and NGOs, what others have been talking about, and something which was also raised is what we are facing in the last few years is a huge expansion of violence. all right? And a lot of expansion of this violence, normalization of violence, the internalization of violence, a lot of it comes from the top, all right? And it's also to do with your current political dispensation and the political dominant ideology which exists. And when I say political, it's political economy. It's put together. So there are many NGOs who have been struggling, women's organizations, human rights, etc. And I'm really very sorry to say that the number of people who have been arrested and put into prison without a trial is, on accusation of sedition is something which is very huge. So you've had Amnesty, which has left India. You have Greenpeace, which has left India. I mean, these are very, very known organizations. ILO, the local office, the national office, they have been struggling and appealing to the government to please look at these labor laws, which are so anti-women and anti-people in general. But there has been absolutely no response where this is concerned. And whatever recourse one had to, political, economic struggles in the sense of unions marching on the streets, etc. The law which came in just last week says you cannot go on strike. It bans strikes. Even a one-day mass casual leave is banned now by law, unless you give a 60 days notice, and there's a whole long process to this entire thing. So the issue of violence and women is, and particularly at work, it's not so much a behavioral issue, what I call a micro issue. It's not as if all men and all employers in the world have gone mad and therefore, they've gone crazy and it's increased. It's also to do to the support of violence at the top. I think, we've had so many cases of women being raped, of children. We have an additional problem. Of course, you have of race, we have it of caste. So there are a lot of rapes of the Dalits or the what is called the lower caste, etc. And also of Muslims. That's another huge divide which has come in India, which was not there to that extent earlier. So your leaders, your women leaders, and even your men leaders, of course, in, whether they are ministers or in the parliament or wherever, will take up the issues only if the child who is raped or a woman who is raped is a Hindu. And if she's a Muslim, it's not going to be talked about at all. Then it's going to be, there terms coming called love jihad. This is a law which has been passed yesterday, that if a Hindu and a Muslim get married, it is love jihad. I mean, the meaning of jihad. This is the kind of thinking. So there is a sanction to violence.
Yeah.
And therefore, the issue of violence against women at work gets subsumed in many cases. It invisibilizes itself, and it becomes really what we call a shadow of what is a reflection at the national level.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. You just reminded me that I've seen how in the name of responses to the pandemic, we've seen governments basically take decisions that, as you said, completely push aside any of these issues related to women discrimination or violence to the side, and they're trumped by other sort of socio-political dynamics at play. So this is a good example of that. We have one question from the audience that I think is interesting to address. I'm going to ask you, Laura, to tackle it, and then we're going to go to some of our closing remarks because we're running out of time. So there's a question from Lori Krieger, who's from Gender Director from USAID, Clean Cities, Blue Ocean. Her question is there a need to differentiate between gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination? If so, how would you do this? I think this is an important question to tackle because there's often, and Monica mentioned this, just so much focus on the violence aspect, but then you have to look at, well, why do we get to the violence in the first place? Because we have to see what aspects are also playing out in society, and in most cases, it's different forms of discrimination. So I'm going to ask you, Laura, to tackle this, and then we'll see if others have anything to add, and we'll go to closing remarks.
Yes, that's a great issue, and I was thinking that as we were discussing, we're sort of blending together violence, which is understood as a physical act, with other forms of discrimination. But I think we're doing that because there is kind of a spectrum, and these issues interrelate. So once a group of people like women are seen as vulnerable or put in vulnerable conditions, they are through acts of discrimination, then they become more susceptible or more vulnerable to other forms leading up to violence. And then violence can then lead up to the extreme form of violence, which is femicide. So it's all a kind of they're all connected. They're not two separate things, discrimination on the one hand and violence on the other. So we need to tackle the root causes, as we often say, which are the forms of discrimination that create the conditions necessary for gender-based violence. So you can't just say, well, physical violence is bad, but it's okay to discriminate against someone. And another point I just wanted to raise was around intersectionality, that we need to be thinking not just about gender-based violence, but violence on the basis of other categories such as race, ethnicity, indigeneity, caste, and sexual orientation as well, because those are all forms of discrimination that can often lead to violence.
Yeah, thank you for that. Monica, do you want to comment on this? You kind of talked about the problem of the reframing of the issue, but do you want to add anything to this from your perspective?
I agree completely with Laura. I just would like to add that maybe for us as part of the movement, it's quite clear, but for the rest of the people, it hasn't been. So maybe we need to go back and double the efforts to address it properly and try to connect with the people and try to help them, and also the women, to understand that the whole thing is connected. So it will be easier to address it.
Yeah, so it's reframing the issues in a way that gives it more, I guess, traction with the authorities and the private sector and others. Rana or Ritu, do you want to comment on this particular issue? The sort of differentiation between gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination, and how they're being tackled in your regions, whether all in one sort of bundle, or are they sort of divided up into different issues? Rana, do you have any?
I think I mentioned everything while I was talking, but I think that the good thing in Jordan is that there are groups that are tackling different issues. As I said, there's this specialized group, one or two groups who are specialized in tackling laws that discriminate against women in the labor force. There is the whole women's movement working on issues related to domestic violence and discrimination and the legislation. So I think it's a bundle. I think it's a bundle, because most of the time when the women's movement wants to address something, they also include clauses in the labor law in addition to other laws. So when they want to give it to decision makers, to the legislator, to the parliament. So I think it all comes together, but there are some specializations, and I think it doesn't harm to have to have some focus on certain topic by certain entities. And as I said, I think and even the women's movement said it, because of the difficulties in reaching victims of domestic violence during the COVID-19, they're all now revising their strategies and procedures to see how they can be more effective in the future, and
Right.
to be effective and to reach victims of domestic violence and discrimination.
Yeah, thank you. Ritu, anything to add to this before we?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, like we consider work as a continuum, violence is also a continuum, because you don't know when the employer's violence starts and the contractors ends, and the public transport violence or the private transport violence. It's just all around, and it's being strengthened. And that is really what I think it's very obvious in all the countries, and is that it's a huge intensification of the patriarchal rigidities, so conceptually, in terms of belief, in terms of whether women should be equal or not, in the context of hugely increasing unemployment. All right, should women be allowed to work or not, or men should be given the priority as providers? So these are issues which are, I think, at every level, these divisions, the gender inequality has been increased. And this is not a matter of few months, or when the pandemic is over, everything is going to be fine. I think we've gone back, I think we've gone back at least a generation, if not, several decades, in terms of the kind of issues which women are facing. Nutrition levels have gone down. Maternal mortality rates have increased. Infant mortality rates have increased. In India, the age at marriage has fallen. Now there have been hundreds of reported cases of girl children as old as 11 and 12 getting married, and there's been no legal thing for this. So we really seem to have regressed a lot in terms of thinking, and therefore all our strategies are linked to this. I think every issue is being taken up by women's groups and human rights groups, not only women's groups, as well as trade union, and we all realize we just have to come together.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're not going to have time to discuss child marriage, but this is yet another facet of this gender-based violence, and it is definitely on the rise. I know in the Middle East it is. So I'm going to turn to all of you now for closing remarks, and I'd like to ask you to identify one thing, or sort of one actionable policy recommendation that has worked in the regions that you are focused on, that you can share with us, because we've identified many of the common challenges and the sort of dynamics between the different stakeholders, and some good examples of groups coming together and moving things forward. But I think it'll be useful in order to ensure that this discussion continues beyond this panel today, about, well, what has worked in your region. Laura, I'll get back to you to kick us off with that.
You want us to be optimistic. Okay. I already mentioned issues related to regularization of domestic workers and informal sector workers, trying to bring them into the formal economy with the rights and benefits that are associated with that. So to me, that's sort of step number one. And I would just also like to mention issues related to global value chains that we haven't really touched upon, but the responsibility of the private sector and also governments to monitor labor conditions in labor-intensive processes that are often located in the global south. We did see some movement happening around this after the Rana Plaza fire, and I think that was not regarding Latin America, but I think it sort of rippled around the world, and I think the COVID crisis could lead to greater attention to the issues related to global value chains that have been so disrupted with the pandemic, and with devastating impact often on women workers located in those factories.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Monica?
I will go with something that happened in Mexico last year. A regulation was passed to protect the well-being of workers. It is up to the private sector to implement it, but from our perspective, it's a good start. I mean, it's not directly enforced to prevent gender-based violence, but it involves the whole thing. So somehow it's starting to address the perspective of the private sector to consider their workers as human beings. So I will go with that. Yeah.
That's a good starting point. Rana? Case from the Middle East or Jordan?
I think what worked in Jordan, in addition to my colleagues, what they said now, is that you have to have a long breath to change things, and you have to lobby the government in the right time and in a very smart and strategic way to be able to get. Unfortunately, you know, rights are not given. You always have to fight for rights. You always have to, you know, extract rights. So just I think the thing that worked here is that there is a lot of the movements. Let's say also even my work, so-called on crimes, this labor laws that changed eventually. It took a lot of time, dedication, persistence, consistent to lobby the government, to lobby politicians, to talk to them about what really matters, what really is going on, and just take it from there. And things will change, but it will take time.
Thank you, Rana, for that. Ritu, last words on this
Yeah,
issue.
Marissa, you want a happy ending to the to the panel?
Just a little bit of light. Just a little bit of light.
State-wise, government-wise, I don't see any happy ending, at least where the center is concerned. But there are several states. You know, we are divided into about 30 different regions with different local governments, etc. And some of them have taken very, very remarkable achievements. And that's really something which has, you know, improved the status of women. Like there is this process of what we call gender budgeting. So in your budgets, you increase the allocation to women, you know, taxation, monetary policy. So there are certain good things. But the best thing that has happened is, I think every organization, every issue, every NGO, every trade union, we are all together in the struggle. And that for me is the biggest strength and I think result of not the pandemic, but of the policy response or the non-response to the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you for helping us find a little bit of hope moving forward. But I think it's important to also acknowledge, because there are many groups across the world who are working tirelessly to keep moving these issues forward. So thank you once again to all of you for your valuable time this morning and expertise and insights into this topic of women and work and the impact of gender-based violence. There's certainly a long way to go, but there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. And thank you to all of you who have joined us this morning in this discussion. Thanks to all the organizers of today's panel and the upcoming activities. So just keep on checking the Wilson Center website and social media platforms for more of the activities planned during the next days of activism against women, against violence against women. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much.